Hello, hello, that is right friends, we are back with another recipe from the Heroes Feast cookbook. And today's recipe comes from the section that's dedicated to the race that I'm probably the most familiar with, the human race. But before we get to the recipe, as I had briefly mentioned in the previous video, we are in fact in a new kitchen. And as fond as I was of the old kitchen, I do hold it very near and dear to my heart, especially because it's where Guild of Gluttony started. I think it's pretty easy to tell that this kitchen is quite an upgrade from the previous one. I mean, just look at the amount of counter space that I have here. I swear everything I do here is gonna look so much cooler. Just look at this shot of Annalise unloading the dishwasher and just how cool she looks twirling that cup in her hand. Man, she makes it look effortless. She's amazing. But for real, working in this kitchen feels like that moment at the end of a session where the DM says, great job tonight. Oh, and also you've leveled up. And that level up gives me so many new abilities to make some of the coolest videos and get some of the best shots that you've ever seen on YouTube out there. I mean, just watch as I hit you with that movie magic, that cinematic spell casting, that Academy Award-winning arcana. It's gonna be great. Now, that brings us to today's recipe, which is called Vedbread, which is a swirled dinner roll with a mushroom and cheese filling. And I know I've said it before, but mushroom and cheese are two of my favorite ingredients to work with ever, even though I don't often get the opportunity to work with mushrooms. But essentially, you can think of Vedbread as a savory cinnamon roll, in a sense. Just without the cinnamon or the sugar or any of the icing on top. But if you'll recall from my Archon's chili video, then you'll know that a lot of people like to pair cinnamon rolls with their chili, which I have confirmed is delicious. And in a same sense, Vedbread goes really well with potato soup, which is what we decided to do along with this recipe. I know that there is a potato soup recipe in Heroes Feast, but that's going to be a separate video on its own. This is just a recipe that we found online. So the first step to making these is that you have to chop up the mushrooms really fine, which you saw me doing throughout all those previous shots to varying degrees of success. And as is common with so many recipes that use mushrooms, you're going to saute them in butter for a little bit. And boy howdy, if melting butter isn't one of the most satisfying things to watch in all of cooking. Tell me I'm wrong. But before adding the mushrooms, we're gonna cook up some shallots for a little bit, just until they're translucent, because they take a little bit longer to cook than the mushrooms will. And one of the most difficult parts of cooking is also one of the most difficult parts of planning a D&D session, getting the timing right. But here we are adding the mushrooms, and look at this glorious slow-mo shot of it just cascading into the bubbling butter and the sizzling onions. I'm sorry, I lost control there for a second. This is a very good recipe. I really enjoyed it. So now that everything's in the pan, you're gonna let it cook for a little while, allowing the liquid inside of the mushroom to cook out. And so it might seem like a lot of filling compared to the serving size that the recipe calls for, but after a short amount of time, you'll notice that it really has shrunk quite a bit. But then after that, you're gonna add your seasonings, which for the filling isn't too crazy. It's just thyme, salt, and pepper. But when you're adding the thyme, just make sure that you're really careful with it and don't spill it all over the floor. But then the other half of the equation for the filling is the cheese. Now the recipe calls for Parmesan for the filling and then Gruyere to actually mix within the dough itself. But I like to buy my cheese from the Italian deli that's pretty near to us, and unfortunately they didn't have Gruyere there, and so I opted for Gouda instead. And as you can see by my face here, clearly two things have proven to be true. One, I love the cheese. Two, my webcam is broken. I've since gotten it fixed, but I'm leaving this clip in nonetheless. So the cheese that's going into the filling is the Parmesan, so you're gonna start out by shredding that, and then eventually you're gonna add it to the mushroom and onion mixture that you've already cooked, so it's gonna melt in with all of that, which is a little bit different than what you're gonna do with the Gruyere or Gouda in my case. You're gonna shred it, and then you're gonna mix that in with the dough itself. So make sure you pay really close attention on this next step, because the recipe calls for 1/4 cup of Parmesan, and you wanna make sure that you're being very precise with your measurements, just like I am here. Obviously, we want to make sure that you never overdo it, because could you imagine having too much cheese in a recipe? Oh, what a nightmare. So yeah, again, just stick to 1/4 cup of Parmesan cheese. You don't want to overdo it. There's no room for error here. So at this point, you're going to want the filling to cool down for a little bit before it actually is interacting with your dough. If your filling is too hot, it might warm up your dough, which might make it a little bit harder to work with. And so I just put it on a plate and spread it out to let it cool while I'm actually making the dough. And so just like every wizard has their trusty spell book, every dough pretty much starts with flour. That was just a metaphor. I know that not every dough actually does start with flour. I know there's variations here, so don't come at me in the comments. But one thing that makes this dough pretty unique is that it calls for buttermilk, which, fun fact, I have actually never cooked with before. A good substitute for buttermilk is to just take regular milk and squeeze a little bit of lemon juice into it. And so to that, you're gonna add some butter and mix that together, which you'll see here does give you a little bit of a chunky mixture, which normally would be pretty unsettling, but the cookbook does give you a heads up on that. So I knew that I was on the right track. And this is what I had mentioned earlier, where the inclusion of the second cheese is actually mixed into the dough itself, which again, I did have some reservations reservations about, but I was more excited just to see what the end result would look like. I wasn't sure if because of the cheese that the dough would be tougher to work with, as in it might crumble a little bit, but thankfully the liquid mixture that we worked with just a few minutes ago did serve as a pretty good binding agent, so it wasn't all that crumbly in the end. And I know, this does look super appealing and delicious right now, but trust me, it does end up looking even better than it does now. So just like every good monk, whenever you discover that equipment and tools don't quite get the job done, you just gotta get in there and use your hands. And like I had mentioned, I did have some concerns about if this would all bind together pretty well. So once I was able to work it a little bit, it did form a nice cohesive dough. I had a bead of force in my back pocket just in case I needed it, but thankfully we were good. And so onto a nicely floured work surface, it was time to roll out the dough. After a few more seconds of kneading just to make sure everything was good, I grabbed my pin of rolling and got to work. I found that this recipe was rather similar to the Vedbread, where you pretty much just make your dough, roll it out flat, and then fill it with whatever goes inside to make your loaf. The big difference here is that you're slicing it into different sections to make rolls instead of an actual loaf. So you can see here that I'm spreading it out evenly across the surface area of the dough. I want to make sure that no adventurer gets gypped out of their share of the spoils and that every bite has the same amount of filling as the last. And so I press the filling into the dough a little bit to ensure that whenever I roll it up, it's not all just going to be falling all over the place. So yeah, you're just going to roll it into a nice long log, and then you're going to pinch along the seam and roll it just a little bit more to ensure that it doesn't come unraveled. And what kind of YouTube cooking channel would I be without providing the people with a great cross section? Not that. How about this one? Yeah, that's the good stuff. This is where I get really excited whenever I can tell that something is starting to look like the pictures in the cookbook. Just make sure at this step to take it nice and slow and make sure that you have a sharp knife, or else you're gonna start smashing them down and it's gonna be a little bit oblong, which of course is fine, but if you've made it this far, why not take an extra 2 minutes to make sure that it does look really good? All for the gram, right? Again, have I mentioned how happy I am having this extra space? Even though a recipe like this really isn't all that space intensive, I just didn't have it at my old spot. So now to have enough counter space where I can go from step to step within the recipe without having to move stuff or clean stuff or rearrange stuff just to get basic tasks done is such a huge relief. So don't take your kitchen for granted, folks. Go give your KitchenAid a kiss right now. So the recipe says that it yields about 14 buns, but I sliced mine maybe a little bit too thin because I ended up with 16, which is fine if you're going to be able to eat all of those quickly, but I found that these didn't keep very well after about 2 or 3 days. So before these get put in the oven, they get hit with a quick egg wash, which is just 1 egg beaten together with a tablespoon of water. And this is just going to help to give the Vedbread a nice golden brown finish. And then it's time to pop these bad boys into the oven, but first make sure if you have an audience that you have to torture them just a little bit and terrorize them with the hand of Vecna.
It is your duty as the one who bears it.
But don't get off track for too long because it's getting late and I'm pretty hungry. And as is custom around here, we're gonna send all of these guys into the oven, which, speaking of oven, look at how clean this one is in comparison to our old one. I just want to call that out because I've been getting a lot of comments on it in the past, and it wasn't our fault. It was dirty when we got there and the cleaning function was broken. And so with a wave and a kiss, we send those into the oven and then we wait. And unfortunately, our webcam was still not working at the time, so the footage for the taste test got lost. So here is the semi-grand reveal. They did come out nice and golden brown, and the flavor was delicious. They had a nice texture to them, and I would recommend these as a side dish to any kind of soup. But yeah, I was really happy with this one, and I'll definitely be making it again in the future.